The air in the dusty square was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and the suffocating despair of the damned. Ilara clutched Rowan to her chest, the child small, warm weight the only anchor in a sea of leering faces and callous shouts. Her arms ached, her throat was raw from unshed screams, but her grip on her son remained unbreakable. Each breath Rowan took against her skin was a defiant flutter of life in this marketplace of human misery. The auctioneer, a portly man named Beres with sweat stains blooming under his arms and eyes like greasy pennies, gestured towards her with a flourish, his voice booming with practiced vulgarity. Next, a healthy young woman, still fit for work, and a babe in arms. 2 for the price of 1, gentlemen. What am I bid for this fine piece? Good teeth, strong back by the look of her, and the boy could be useful in a few years. His words were lashes, stripping away the last vestiges of her dignity, branding her as chattel, a thing to be owned, used, discarded. Men shouted numbers, their eyes crawling over her, calculating her worth in terms of labor or something far more vile. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer caught in her throat, for an end, any end, to this horror. Rowan stirred, whimpering, and her eyes snapped open, a fierce protectiveness surging through her, a fire in the desolate landscape of her soul. She would not break. Not while he lived. Then, a stillness fell over a section of the rough crowd. A hand was raised. Not a grimy hand from the usual bidders, but a brown, steady hand, belonging to a man who stood apart, a figure of stark quietude in the raucous assembly. He was tall, lean, his black hair drawn back from a face that seemed carved from the desert rock itself, his eyes dark and unreadable as obsidian. He wore simple buckskin, and his presence was a silent rebuke to the squalor around him. Beres squinted, surprised. Well now, what's this? The silent brave fancies a purchase? What's your bid, then? The man's voice, when it came, was low, yet it cut through the murmuring. 20 silver pieces. A gasp went through the crowd. It was more than anyone had offered, more than she was arguably worth in their cruel estimation, especially with a child. Beres's eyes gleamed with avarice. 20 silver. Do I hear 25? Going once. No other bids came. The townsfolk seemed wary, almost fearful, of this outsider. Going twice. Sold. To the Navajo, for 20 silver pieces. The gavel cracked like a bone snapping. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She had been bought, her fate sealed by a stranger whose intentions were a terrifying unknown. He had paid for her, for Rowan, with coins that felt as heavy as gravestones, rescuing her from the immediate hyenas only, perhaps, to deliver her to a different kind of wolf. The man moved towards the platform, his steps measured, his gaze fixed on her, not with lust or malice, but with an unnerving intensity that offered no comfort, only a deeper abyss of uncertainty. The Navajo warrior, Cale, paid Beres the silver coins, their clink echoing in the sudden silence that had enveloped the auction block. He did not look at the auctioneer, his focus solely on Ilara and the child. With a curt nod, he indicated the crude rope that bound her wrists loosely in front of her. Beres, eager to conclude the transaction with the unsettling stranger, fumbled to untie her. As the rope fell away, Ilara rubbed her chafed skin, her eyes never leaving Cale. He gestured with his head, a silent command to follow. She hesitated, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. Where was he taking her? What did he want? But the memory of the leering faces in the crowd, the filth of the holding pen she had endured, propelled her forward. Anywhere had to be better than that. Clutching Rowan, who had mercifully fallen into an exhausted sleep, she stepped down from the platform, her legs unsteady. Cale turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if she followed, his confidence in her compliance absolute. The crowd parted for him, their earlier jeers replaced by suspicious murmurs and averted gazes. Ilara walked behind him, the dust of the town clinging to her ragged dress, the sun beating down relentlessly. Each step was an effort, her body protesting the abuse and neglect it had suffered. The eyes of the townsfolk burned into her back, a mixture of contempt and a strange, resentful curiosity. She kept her head high, her focus on the broad, buckskin-clad back in front of her. He moved with a lithe, enduring rhythm, seemingly unaffected by the oppressive heat or the rough terrain as they left the squalid settlement behind. The landscape opened up, vast and indifferent, the jagged peaks of distant mountains shimmering under a brassy sky. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, much like the men who inhabited it. Hours passed. The silence between them was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and Rowan's occasional soft sigh. Ilara's throat grew parched, her lips cracked. Just as she felt she could go no further, Cale stopped. He unslung a water skin from his shoulder and offered it to her. She looked at him, suspicious, but her thirst was a raging fire. She drank, the water cool and clean, a momentary reprieve. He then produced a piece of dried meat and a small, hard biscuit, offering them to her with the same impassive expression. She ate slowly, aware of his gaze, though it was not overtly threatening. It was watchful, assessing. He had bought her, yes, but his actions so far were not those of a cruel master. They were practical, almost detached, yet there was a thread of something akin to consideration in the provision of water and food. She didn't understand him. Was this a reprieve, or merely a different cage? The fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tinged with a fragile, desperate hope. As dusk began to bleed across the vast, indifferent sky, painting the stark landscape in hues of purple and bruised orange, Cale found a shallow alcove beneath an outcrop of weathered rock. He gestured for Ilara to sit, then, with swift, efficient movements, gathered dry brush and kindled a small, almost smokeless fire. The flames brought a small measure of warmth against the rapidly cooling desert air, a tiny beacon in the encroaching darkness. He sat on the opposite side of the fire, not close enough to be threatening, yet not so far as to seem entirely removed. His gaze was mostly on the flames, or out into the shadows that danced beyond their flickering light, giving Ilara the space to breathe, to observe him without feeling like prey. Rowan, nestled in her arms, finally succumbed to a deeper sleep, his small face peaceful in the firelight. Exhaustion pulled at Ilara, a heavy cloak she could barely sustain, yet true rest remained elusive. Her mind replayed the horrors of the auction, the chilling finality of the gavel, the uncertainty of her new reality. She watched Cale. His face, illuminated by the fire, was a study in contrasts, harsh lines etched by sun and wind, yet a stillness in his dark eyes that hinted at depths she could not fathom. He exuded an aura of quiet capability, of belonging to this wild, untamed land in a way she, a broken piece of a shattered world, could never comprehend. He shared more of the dried meat and a handful of roasted nuts he produced from a pouch at his belt. She ate, her hunger a dull ache. After a while, he rose and retrieved a worn but clean woolen blanket from his saddle roll. He held it out to her. "For the child," he said, his voice a low rumble, the word spare, almost rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since his bid, beyond the single word safe at their arrival. The simple statement, the unexpected provision, caught her off guard. It was a small gesture, yet in her world, where kindness was a forgotten currency, it felt monumental. She took the blanket, her fingers brushing his briefly. His skin was calloused, warm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words sticking in her throat. He gave a curt nod, then returned to his vigil by the fire, his silence settling around them once more, though now it felt less like a wall and more like a quiet, encompassing space. She wrapped Rowan snugly in the blanket, its rough wool a surprising comfort. Perhaps, just perhaps, this silent warrior was not the monster her fears had painted him to be. The days that followed fell into a monotonous rhythm of walking, the sun a relentless overseer in the vast, empty sky. Ilara learned to anticipate Cale's pace, his infrequent stops for water or rest. He moved with an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ground, the subtle shifts in the wind. He never spoke of their destination, never offered explanations, yet his actions conveyed a clear purpose. He was leading her somewhere, away from the brutal settlements of men like Beris, deeper into a wilderness that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Rowan, surprisingly, adapted to the journey better than she did. The fresh air, the constant motion, seemed to agree with him. He would gurgle and coo when awake, his innocent sounds a stark contrast to the grim silence of their passage. Cale, though he rarely acknowledged the child directly, would sometimes pause when Rowan became particularly restless, an almost imperceptible softening around his eyes the only sign that he noticed. On one such occasion, Rowan fussed, batting at Ilara's face. Cale stopped, reached into a pouch, and produced a small, smoothly carved piece of wood, shaped vaguely like a bird. He offered it to Ilara, who hesitated, then gave it to Rowan. The baby grasped it immediately, his cry subsiding as he explored the new object with his mouth and tiny fingers. Cale watched for a moment, then resumed walking. No words were exchanged, but the gesture resonated with Ilara. It was an act of unexpected thoughtfulness, a quiet acknowledgement of her child's needs. Her fear of Cale had not vanished entirely, but it was slowly being overlaid with a layer of weary curiosity, even a grudging respect. She saw him treat his sturdy pony with a quiet care, checking its hooves each evening, murmuring to it in a language she didn't understand but whose cadence was gentle. This contrasted sharply with the casual cruelty she had witnessed from other men towards their animals. The land itself was a harsh teacher. Cale showed her, often without words, how to find water in unlikely places, a seep at the base of a rock, moisture cupped in the leaves of a particular plant. He pointed out edible roots and berries, and those that were poison. She was a slow student, her mind still clouded by trauma, but she watched, she learned, driven by the primal instinct to survive, for Rowan's sake if not her own. At night, the ghosts of her past still visited her dreams, the faces of her former captors, the loss of her freedom, the constant humiliation. She would wake with a gasp, clutching Rowan tightly, the fear a cold serpent coiling in her belly. But then she would see Cale still form by the dying embers of the fire, a silent sentinel, and a fragile sense of security would allow her to drift back into a troubled sleep. After what felt like an eternity of relentless travel, the terrain began to change. They descended into a winding canyon, its high red walls providing blessed shade from the scorching sun. The air grew cooler, and the silence here was different, deeper, imbued with a sense of ancient stillness. Ilara felt a subtle shift in Cale's demeanor, a relaxing of the tension that always seemed to reside in his shoulders. He led her along a narrow, almost invisible path, until they rounded a massive boulder and a hidden alcove came into view. Nestled against the sheer cliff face was a dwelling, constructed of stone and sturdy timbers, its lines blending seamlessly with the natural rock. It was small, simple, yet it exuded an aura of strength and belonging. Smoke curled faintly from a hole in the roof, hinting at a recent fire. Cale stopped, turning to her. He gestured towards the dwelling. "Here," he said, his voice low. Safe, the word, so sparsely used by him, carried immense weight. He had brought her to his home. Ilara stared, a mixture of awe and trepidation swirling within her. This was so far removed from anything she had ever known. The brutal squalor of the towns, the refined cruelty of her previous life, they seemed to belong to another world, another existence entirely. This place felt clean, untouched by the ugliness she had endured. Cale dismounted and led his horse towards a small, brush-fenced corral. He then walked to the entrance of the dwelling, a heavy wooden door, and pushed it open, waiting for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment, then, taking a deep breath, stepped across the threshold. Inside, it was cool and dim. A single room, a packed earth floor covered with woven mats in places. A stone hearth occupied one corner, a few simple cooking pots beside it. Sleeping furs were neatly rolled against one wall. It was spare, utilitarian, yet impeccably clean and orderly. There was a profound sense of peace within these stone walls. Cale followed her in, his presence filling the small space but not crowding it. He showed her a large clay olive filled with fresh water, indicated sacks of grain and dried provisions stored in a cool recess of the rock. Food. Water, he stated, simply. There were no demands in his voice, no expectations in his eyes. He had provided shelter, sustenance, safety. What came next, she did not know, but for the first time since her capture, a flicker of something other than fear ignited within her. Rowan, sensing the shift in atmosphere, perhaps the deep calm of the place, let out a contented coo and snuggled closer against her. Ilara looked around the humble dwelling, and a single, unexpected tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Week settled into a quiet rhythm within the hidden canyon. Ilara, slowly, tentatively, began to inhabit the space Kale had provided. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a watchful weariness, and then, gradually, by a fragile sense of security. Kale was a man of routine and profound silence. He would rise before dawn, disappearing into the wilderness to hunt or check snares, returning hours later with game, or sometimes, simply with the scent of pine and earth clinging to him. He never asked anything of her, never imposed his will. He ate his meals quietly, often mending his gear or sharpening his tools by the firelight in the evenings. He moved with a grace and purpose that spoke of a deep connection to the world around him, a world Ilara was only just beginning to perceive beyond the veil of her trauma. She focused on Rowan, her love for him a fierce, unwavering light. The child thrived in the canyon's peace, his laughter echoing softly against the stone walls, a sound that sometimes brought a fleeting, almost imperceptible softness to Kale's stoic features. Ilara found herself observing Kale more closely, noticing the intricate skill in his hands as he fashioned an arrow or braided a rope from plant fibers. She saw the way he listened to the wind, the way his eyes scanned the patterns of light and shadow on the canyon walls, reading a language she didn't understand. He was a part of this wild place, as much as the hawks that circled overhead or the ancient junipers that clung to the cliffs. Slowly, she began to contribute to their shared existence in small ways. She kept the dwelling tidy, ground grain for flatbread, and mended their meager clothing. One day, sifting through a sack of provisions Kale had brought back from a distant, solitary trading foray, she found a small handful of dried beans and squash seeds. An idea, a tiny spark of initiative, took root. She found a sun-drenched patch of earth near the stream that trickled through the canyon floor. Using a sharpened stick, she painstakingly cleared the stubborn weeds and loosened the soil, planting the seeds with a prayer she hadn't realized she still possessed. It was a small act of defiance against the barrenness of her recent past, a tentative claim on the future. Kale noticed her efforts. He said nothing, his face unreadable as he watched her toil under the sun. But the next morning, she found a sturdy, well-made digging stick propped against the wall of the dwelling, near where she had left her makeshift tool. The unspoken acknowledgement, the quiet support, warmed her more than the desert sun. Healing was not a destination, she realized, but a slow, arduous journey, marked by such small, almost invisible gestures of understanding. The fragile peace of the canyon was shattered one late afternoon. Ilara was by the stream, rinsing Rowan's linen wraps, when she saw Kale, high on the canyon rim, freeze. His posture, usually relaxed when in his own territory, became taut, alert, like a wolf scenting danger. He raised a hand, a swift, silent signal for her to get back to the dwelling, then melted into the rocks, disappearing from sight as if the earth itself had swallowed him. A cold dread seized Ilara. She snatched Rowan, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and scrambled back to the shelter, her mind racing. Had Beres found them? Had bounty hunters picked up her trail? The possibilities were all terrifying. Inside the dim dwelling, she barred the heavy door, her hands trembling. She held Rowan close, whispering soothing nonsense, though her own fear was a palpable thing in the small space. Hours crawled by, each rustle of wind outside, each cry of a distant bird, amplifying her terror. She had no weapon save for a small skinning knife Kale used for game, but she clutched it, her knuckles white, ready to defend her child, her newfound sanctuary, with the last breath in her body. The sun dipped below the canyon walls, plunging their refuge into deep shadow, then darkness. Still, Kale did not return. Ilara lit no fire, wanting no sign of their presence. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any indication of what was happening beyond their stone walls. Doubt began to creep in. What if he had abandoned her? What if the threat was too great? But then, just as a sliver of moon crested the canyon rim, the door creaked softly. Ilara tensed, knife raised. Kale's silhouette filled the opening. He stepped inside, silent as a shadow, and rebarred the door. He looked weary, lines of fatigue etched deeper around his eyes and mouth, a faint scratch on his cheekbone the only visible sign of a confrontation. He moved to the hearth, and only then did she see the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "A rider," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "He was tracking. He will not come back, just that." No further explanation, no embellishment. But Ilara understood. He had intercepted the threat, dealt with it in his own way, ensuring their continued safety. Later, by the faint light of the moon filtering through a small opening, she saw him meticulously cleaning an arrow, wiping away a dark stain from its fletching. The implication was clear, chilling, and yet, perversely, reassuring. He had protected them. The danger had been real, immediate, and he had faced it for them. In that moment, she understood the depth of his commitment, the silent vow he had made when he raised his hand at that dreadful auction. He was not just a provider, he was a guardian, a shield against the cruelties of the world she had barely escaped. The encounter with the tracker, though terrifying, acted as a crucible, forging a new, unspoken understanding between Ilara and Cale. The shared danger, the reaffirmation of his protection, had subtly altered the dynamic of their quiet existence. Ilara found a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience born from the ashes of her past and nurtured in the sanctuary of the canyon. The fear still lingered, a shadow in the corners of her mind, but it no longer held dominion over her. One cool evening, as they sat by the fire, Rowan asleep in a small cradle Cale had fashioned from woven reeds, Ilara felt an overwhelming need to reclaim a part of herself that had been stolen. She looked at Cale, his profile stark against the flickering flames. "My name," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "is Ilara. And my son, he is Rowan." It was a simple declaration, yet it felt like breaking free from invisible chains. For so long, she had been nameless, a possession, a number. To speak her name, her son's name, in this safe place, to this quiet man, was an act of profound self-assertion. Cale turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, considering gaze. After a long moment, he spoke. "I am Cale." The exchange was brief, almost stark, yet it resonated with an unspoken significance. It was an acknowledgement of identity, of personhood, a quiet bridging of the chasm that had separated their worlds. From that night on, Ilara found her voice more often. She spoke of small things, the way Rowan was trying to stand, the progress of her tiny garden, the changing colors of the canyon walls with the shifting seasons. Cale remained a man of few words, but he listened, his silence no longer a barrier but an attentive presence. Sometimes he would respond with a quiet observation of his own, a piece of lore about the land, a comment on the ways of an animal. One evening, noticing a long, faded scar that traced a line along his forearm, she found the courage to ask, "How did you get this?" He looked down at the mark, a shadow passing over his face. "A wolf," he said, his voice softer than usual. "When I was a boy." It was a test. He offered no more, but that small shard of his past, shared willingly, felt like a precious gift. It hinted at his own trials, his own journey to becoming the man he was, a man who understood survival, and perhaps, understood suffering too. A lingering disquiet sometimes troubled Ilara, a fear that her past, or the world's judgment, could still reach into their protected haven. One afternoon, while Cale was away hunting, she was tidying the dwelling and came across a worn leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a spare sleeping fur. It was not like Cale's few, practical possessions. Her breath caught. The book was of a type used by traders, by men who kept meticulous accounts of goods, of debts, of acquisitions. Men like Beres. A cold dread washed over her. Had Cale been involved in that world more deeply than she knew? Was she, in his eyes, still just an item, a transaction recorded somewhere? The thought was a betrayal of the fragile trust she had built. Cale returned to find her staring at the ledger, her face pale. He looked from the book to her, his expression unreadable. He walked over, took the ledger gently from her hands, and sat down. "This," he said, his voice calm, "belonged to my father." He opened it. The first few pages were indeed filled with columns of figures, names of goods traded, furs, tools, sometimes even livestock. He traded with many people. Some were not like Beres. Some were fair. Then Cale turned to the back of the ledger. There, the neat columns gave way to something entirely different, delicate, detailed sketches of plants, their leaves and roots carefully drawn. Diagrams of star constellations. Notes on animal tracks, observations of weather patterns. "He taught me to see," Cale said softly, tracing a drawing of a medicinal herb with his finger. "To record not just what things are worth in silver, but what they are." Ilara looked at the drawings, then at Cale, shame flooding her for her suspicion. She had been so conditioned by her past, by the constant threat of being valued only for her utility or her price, that she had projected that fear onto him. The ledger was not a symbol of her commodification, but a testament to a different kind of knowledge, a different way of valuing the world. Taking a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a smooth, flat stone she often used for grinding seeds, Ilara sat beside him. Slowly, tentatively, she began to draw. First, a simple outline of Rowan's sleeping form, then a more hesitant sketch of herself, not as she had been, broken, auctioned, but as she felt now, a woman finding her strength in the quiet of the canyon. She drew her hand tending to one of the small plants in her garden. Cale watched, his usual stoicism softened by a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, understanding, perhaps even a quiet approval. She was no longer an item in a ledger, but a creator of her own story, her own image. Seasons turned in the hidden canyon. The harsh sun of summer mellowed into the crisp, golden light of autumn, then yielded to the sharp, clear cold of winter, where snow dusted the high rims like powdered sugar. Spring returned, painting the canyon floor with a riot of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a testament to life's tenacious beauty. Rowan, no longer a babe in arms, was a sturdy toddler, his adventurous explorations filling their small world with laughter and the patter of determined little feet. He chatted incessantly, a mixture of single words and expressive babble, often directed at Cale, who would listen with a rare, quiet attentiveness, sometimes even responding with a gentle grunt or a nod that Rowan seemed to understand perfectly. Ilara herself had transformed. The haunted, fearful woman who had stumbled out of that dusty auction yard was gone. In her place stood a woman of quiet resilience, her eyes clear, her movements imbued with a newfound confidence. The harshness of her past had not been erased, but it no longer defined her. She had learned the rhythms of the canyon, the language of the wind and the stars. Her small garden flourished under her patient care, a vibrant patch of green that supplemented their diet and fed her soul. The bond between her and Cale had deepened, settling into a comfortable, unspoken companionship. Words remained sparse between them, but their silences were rich with understanding, with shared experience. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, two solitary beings who had found an unexpected solace in each other's presence. One cool morning, as the first rays of dawn spilled over the eastern cliffs, painting the sandstone walls in hues of rose and gold, Ilara stood at the entrance of their dwelling, Rowan asleep at her feet. Cale came to stand beside her, not touching, but his presence a warm, solid anchor. They watched the sunrise in comfortable silence for a long time. "The world is large," Cale observed, his voice a low murmur, more a thought spoken aloud than a statement requiring response. Ilara turned her head to look at him, at the strong lines of his face, the quiet wisdom in his dark eyes. A soft smile touched her lips. "Yes," she agreed, her voice clear and steady. "And we have found our place in it." It was not a grand declaration of victory over her oppressors, no dramatic confrontation or fiery revenge. It was something far more profound, a quiet assertion of peace, of belonging, of a life reclaimed and rebuilt from the ashes. The future remained an uncharted territory, but looking at her son, at the steadfast man beside her, at the wild, beautiful sanctuary they called home, Ilara felt not fear, but a deep, abiding hope. She had found more than safety, she had found herself.